Today we're diving into the harrowing case of the Vaughn family, a story that continues to captivate and horrify people to this day. On June 14, 2007, on a quiet highway near Bluff Road, police discovered a car parked by the roadside. Inside were the lifeless bodies of 34-year-old Kimberly Vaughn and her 3 children, 12-year-old Abigail, 11-year-old Cassandra, and 8-year-old Blake. All of them had been shot at close range. The sole survivor was Christopher Vaughn, the father who had only minor injuries. He claimed that his wife, Kimberly, had shot him before killing their children and herself. However, Christopher couldn't provide any clear details, citing a sudden memory lapse. The investigation into this case lasted 5 years before a final verdict was reached. Yet even today, some people question whether justice was truly served. The case remains a hot topic on popular talk shows, where it raises more questions than answers. We'll take a closer look at this tragic story, starting from the beginning. Kimberly Phillips and Christopher Vaughn had been together for over a decade, raising 3 children. From the outside, they appeared to be a happy and close-knit family. Kimberly, whose maiden name was Phillips, was born in December 1972 in St. Charles, Missouri. She grew up in a well-to-do family with 2 sisters, Jennifer and Elizabeth. Interestingly, Jennifer was Kimberly's twin. The Phillips family invested in their daughter's education and personal development. Kimberly attended a prestigious school, was active in sports, and was known for being open, friendly, and sociable. Christopher Vaughn, on the other hand, was born in September 1974 in St. Louis, Missouri. He was one of 3 sons in a modest but close-knit family. During his school years, Christopher was deeply involved in soccer, loved hiking, camping, and enjoyed family trips out of town. The couple met in the early 1990s and quickly fell in love. From the beginning, Kimberly's parents opposed their relationship, as Christopher was younger than Kimberly, didn't have a stable job, and came from a less affluent background. But the couple was deeply in love and ignored the objections. Kimberly soon became pregnant, and in the summer of 1994, they married. At the time of the wedding, Christopher was not yet 20, and Kimberly was only slightly older. Despite their youth, they seemed ready for family life. Their first child, Abigail, was born 4 months after the wedding in October 1994. A year later, they welcomed their second daughter, Cassandra, and 3 years later, their son, Blake. The early years of their marriage were marked by love and happiness. They raised their children, made plans for the future, and built a life together. The children were talented, artistic, and active in sports and music. Kimberly was a homemaker, deeply involved in her children's lives, serving as the head of the PTA and the leader of their scout troop. Christopher, meanwhile, founded and grew a small cybersecurity company. After a few years, the family moved to Washington State, and by the early 2000s, they had settled in a small town in Illinois, where they bought a spacious home. Kimberly decided to pursue a law degree and enrolled in a local university, earning her diploma just a month before the tragedy. On the surface, the Vaughns seemed like the perfect family, but behind closed doors, their relationship was strained. Christopher often traveled for work, and during these trips, he began an affair with a woman named Jill. This affair lasted for about a year before Kimberly found out, leading to a serious rift in the marriage. Although they decided to stay together for the sake of their children, the tension between them only grew. Kimberly became increasingly distrustful of Christopher, suspecting him of continued infidelity, which, as it turned out, was not entirely unfounded. As Kimberly's health began to deteriorate due to the growing tension in her life, she started experiencing severe anxiety, migraines, and depression. Insomnia and blood pressure issues also plagued her, forcing her to seek medical help. She was prescribed several medications to manage her condition, which she took regularly for about a year. Additionally, she attended sessions with a psychologist, where she confided in the professional about the problems in her marriage. Despite her struggles, Kimberly remained sociable, friendly, and active. Her husband, however, was described by those who knew him as a withdrawn introvert who rarely showed emotion. In June 2007, just before their 13th wedding anniversary, the couple decided to take a family trip to an amusement park in Springfield, Illinois. Christopher had chosen the destination, and the rest of the family supported the idea. In the early morning hours of June 14th, the Vaughn family set off in their SUV. A few hours later, Christopher was found by a passing car, bloodied and wandering along the highway. He had a wound on his leg and calmly claimed that his wife had shot him, but he couldn't recall anything more, blaming a sudden lapse in memory. According to Christopher, they had been on their way to the amusement park when Kimberly felt carsick and asked him to stop. He pulled over to the side of the road and got out of the car to check the roof rack. That's when he heard a gunshot, and everything became a blur. He claimed he saw blood running down his leg, and in a state of shock, ran away, unaware of the fate of his children until he was picked up by a passerby. Christopher was unable to remember where his SUV was parked, but the police soon found it. Inside, they discovered the bodies of Kimberly and their 3 children, all shot to death. Kimberly had been shot once in the head, while the children had each been shot twice. Christopher admitted that he owned a gun, which he believed Kimberly might have taken and used. He asserted that she had killed their children, shot him, and then turned the gun on herself. Throughout his recounting, Christopher showed little emotion, which raised suspicions. Even when the police presented him with photos of his dead family during an interrogation, his calm demeanor was unsettling. Kimberly's parents learned about the tragedy through a reporter who insensitively called them at home, asking if they believed Christopher could have harmed his family. Initially, many people defended Christopher, believing he couldn't have committed such a heinous act. They speculated that someone else might have been involved. However, the police, who had seen the crime scene, were convinced that the murders were domestic in nature and no other suspects were considered. During subsequent interrogations, Christopher couldn't recall any new details, but he maintained that Kimberly could have been the one to kill their children, wound him, and then take her own life. He blamed her actions on the medications she had been taking and the strain in their relationship caused by his infidelity. He explained his memory loss as a result of shock, which also explained why he hadn't immediately called the police or emergency services. Despite his unconvincing story, there wasn't enough evidence to arrest Christopher immediately. The police searched the family's home and seized the couple's laptops for investigation. While the preliminary investigation continued, Christopher remained free, even organizing the funeral for his wife and children. The funeral was scheduled for June 23rd and took place at a local funeral home. A large crowd attended, and many noticed the tension between the Vaughn and Phillips families. Just before the funeral service began, a police car arrived, and Christopher was arrested on charges of murdering his family. He remained calm and went with the police without resistance, but his parents were outraged, arguing that their son was not even allowed to say goodbye to his family, while his guilt had not yet been proven. Given the extensive media coverage of the case, the Vaughn family believed that Christopher's arrest at the funeral was a tactic to attract more public attention. Meanwhile, the Phillips family welcomed the arrest. Kimberly's mother expressed relief, saying she was glad her daughter had been cleared of suspicion for the deaths of her children. From the outset, investigators were skeptical of Christopher's account, but he consistently attributed his lack of recollection to a sudden memory lapse, insisting that his wife was the one responsible for the horrific crime. He considered himself fortunate that the bullet only grazed the soft tissue of his thigh, missing any major blood vessels. As the investigation progressed, it was discovered that Christopher had taken out a life insurance policy on his wife, which would have entitled him to a $1 million payout in the event of her death. The deeper the police delved into the case, the more convinced they became that Christopher was the primary suspect in this terrible tragedy. The investigation spanned over 5 years, and throughout this time, Christopher remained in custody despite his repeated claims of innocence. He faced a slew of serious charges, and if found guilty, he could have been sentenced to death. Under state law, he was provided with attorneys funded by a special program that offered legal defense to those facing capital punishment. Christopher's defense team worked diligently to shift the blame onto his late wife, Kimberly. They presented evidence suggesting that Kimberly suffered from various mental health issues, exacerbated by the marital crisis stemming from Christopher's infidelity and her subsequent health problems. They argued that the medications she had been prescribed only worsened her condition. The defense nearly succeeded in convincing the court that Kimberly had taken the loaded gun on their family trip, killed their children, wounded her husband, and then taken her own life. The evidence seemed to support this narrative, making the case appear nearly resolved. However, during this time, the state enacted reforms that abolished the death penalty. As a result, Christopher lost the attorneys whose services were funded by the Capital Defense Program. They requested $250,000 to continue their work, but Christopher couldn't afford to pay. He was then assigned a public defender who had to start the case from scratch and build a new defense strategy. Unfortunately for Christopher, the new defense was far less convincing. A breakthrough in the case came when investigators examined Christopher's personal laptop, seized during a search of his home. It revealed an extensive correspondence with a Canadian resident named Steve Weilert, whom Christopher had met on a social networking site about 10 months before the tragedy. The two men exchanged messages almost daily, with Christopher frequently expressing his deep unhappiness in his marriage. He confided to Steve that he had grown tired of family life and fantasized about escaping into the wilderness, far from civilization. They discussed survival skills, camping, and living off the grid in forests, deserts, and mountains. At one point, Christopher tried to persuade Steve to help him fake his own death so that he could escape from his family. When Steve refused, Christopher declared that he would still leave his family, job, and city life to live in the remote Canadian wilderness where no one could find him. About a month before the tragedy, Christopher began writing about a woman named Maya, whom he claimed to be in love with and planned to take with him when he fled. Police quickly tracked down Maya, who turned out to be a dancer at a local strip club that Christopher frequented. They had dated for several months, during which time Christopher complained about his unhappy family life and even suggested they run away together. However, Maya found the idea foolish and declined. It also emerged that Christopher had been involved with another young dancer, whom he had lied to about being single and childless. In his attempts to impress her, he spent a significant amount of money and proposed they flee to another country together. The trial of Christopher Vaughn began in the fall of 2012 and garnered significant media attention. During the trial, evidence was presented that Christopher had purchased a gun shortly before the tragedy and had visited shooting ranges multiple times to practice. Notably, he had been at the range the night before the family trip. Forensic experts determined that the bullet wound on Christopher's thigh had been inflicted at nearly point-blank range, contradicting his claim that Kimberly shot him from inside the car while he was outside. Another crucial piece of evidence was the bloodstains found on Christopher's clothing. Prosecutors argued that if Christopher had indeed exited the car before any violence occurred, there should have been no way for his wife's blood, or that of his children, to end up on his clothes. Moreover, Kimberly's blood was not found on the murder weapon or on her hands, which would have been impossible if she had shot herself in the head. Instead, there was a drop of Christopher's blood on Kimberly's thumb, suggesting she had been in close contact with him after he was injured. Additionally, forensic searches of Christopher's work computer revealed that he had researched detailed methods for staging a crime scene, further incriminating him in the deaths of his family. At the trial, Kimberly's physician provided critical testimony, stating that while she suffered from insomnia, headaches, and high blood pressure, for which she was prescribed several medications, she never exhibited any signs of suicidal thoughts or a desire to harm herself or others. Despite the defense's efforts, the jury found Christopher guilty on all counts. For the brutal crime of murdering his entire family, Christopher Vaughn was sentenced to 4 life sentences, one for each family member, without the possibility of parole. Shortly after receiving this harsh sentence, Vaughn made a surprising statement, claiming that he suddenly remembered the events of that tragic day in great detail and that he had never actually lost his memory. According to his new account, the gunshots rang out after he exited the car. Initially, he was confused about what was happening, but then he saw the bodies of his children. At that moment, he claimed his wife shot him in the leg, shouting that everything was his fault, before turning the gun on herself. This new testimony was dismissed as absurd and had no impact on the verdict. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Christopher's parents have continued to fight to clear his name in the court of public opinion. For years, they have appeared on various talk shows, given interviews, and maintained blogs and social media accounts where they portray their son as a victim of an unhappy marriage. They also blame the Phillips family, insisting that Kimberly's relatives never accepted Christopher and made his life a living hell from the very beginning. The Vaughn family has filed multiple petitions for clemency, seeking either to have Christopher acquitted and to have his sentence reduced. Several of these petitions were addressed to the state governor, who, after reviewing the case, declared that he had no reason to doubt the fairness of the court's decision. The governor emphasized that the murder of one's own family is one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, and in this case, there would be no leniency or justification. As we learn from these sad events, it's important to stay aware, help those who might need it, and always take care of each other. Stay safe and look out for warning signs in those around you.